Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Connie Kim. The coronavirus pandemic sent shockwaves through North Korea's economy. Its trade volume took a deep dive, and there are no signs that its landmark tourist construction project has been completed. While there were speculations of Chairman Kim Jong-un's whereabouts, North Korea media says that its leader attended a fertilizer plant opening ceremony. What moves will North Korea make in order to pursue its self-reliant economy? Today, joining us from Boston is Gary Seymore, director of the Crown for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. Mr. Samore had served both President Obama and President Clinton as a senior official in the National Security Council responsible for non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Scott Snyder also joins us from Virginia today. He's a senior fellow for Korea Studies and director of the program on U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of Seoul's foreign policy and strategic choices. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be with you.
Thank you, Connie.
Thank you. Now, I want to start with North Korea's trade data. So North Korea's exports to China since the pandemic outbreak has hit an all-time low, and the imports to China doesn't look good either. So how difficult do you think North Korea's economic situation is right now?
Well, there's no doubt that the coronavirus has hurt North Korea's economy, as it's hurt most countries. But I think we don't know yet how long that damage will last. We see China and other countries, including South Korea, trying to reopen their economy and manage the danger from the virus. I expect North Korea will try to do the same thing. So it may be that what's happening in terms of disruption to Chinese North Korean trade could be temporary. So by the spring or summer, things may have returned to normal. Or it could be that the virus, there's another outbreak and the disruption is much longer, in which case the economic damage would be worse. I just don't think we know at this point.
Mm-hmm. And I want to take a look at the Wonsan Galma tourist construction project, Mr. Snyder. So it was speculated to be completed marking the late founder Kim Il-sung's birthday, but we haven't seen any reports come out from North Korea of its completion, and we know it's already been postponed before. So what does this tell you about North Korea's economic difficulties in the face of the pandemic?
Well, I think it is evidence of economic distress. We've known that North Korea is facing some economic distress since the end of last year, based on the party's encouragement of efforts at self-strengthening and reliance on its own efforts. But I think that what might be more serious at this point is that the shutdown in imports to North Korea would diminish the ability of North Korea to get the materials necessary to complete the project. And it also might be reflective of a hard currency shortage in North Korea.
So the drop in the total trade volume of North Korea may lead to social problems, and Secretary Pompeo did mention the concern of a risk of famine in North Korea in the face of the pandemic. So how do you think this pandemic, on top of the already imposed sanctions, could affect North Korea's food supplies going forward?
Well, I think it's very difficult to know because North Korea does have the ability to mobilize resources in a way that most governments don't. And North Korea has the ability to withstand economic damage in a way that most countries don't because it's a dictatorial state. We know, for example, in the 1990s, when we were negotiating the agreed framework, there was a terrible famine in North Korea that killed many North Koreans, and yet the government was able to withstand that. So we may be entering a period where we have a similar kind of deprivation out in the countryside, and yet in the capital and in the cities, they're able to keep the food supply intact.
Mm-hmm. What are your prospects for the famine in North Korea, Mr. Snyder? Do you expect a comparable disastrous situation like we saw in North Korea in the 1990s, like Mr. Samore mentioned?
I think that under current circumstances, North Korea is more dependent on supply chains from China in order to achieve food security than perhaps was the case back in the 1990s. at the same time, the likelihood that North Korea would face an absolute food deficit of the sort that it experienced in the mid-1990s is actually less. The internal conditions for producing food seem to be a little bit better than was the case at that time.
Breaking the 20-day-long silence of the whereabouts of Chairman Kim Jong-un, North Korea claims that its leader attended a fertilizer plant opening ceremony. Now, this is a location where Chairman Kim chose to visit as his first public visit this year. Why do you think this location was chosen again?
Well, this was the location that Kim Jong-un visited at the beginning of the year following the Central Committee meeting that occurred in December of last year. And so it represents self-reliance and an effort to promote economic capacity within North Korea. And it may just be that the fertilizer factory is now complete. And so it was the place that offered the most reasonable opportunity for Kim Jong-un to make a public appearance.
Mm-hmm. So there were a lot of questions of where Chairman Kim could possibly be. And what do you think North Korea watchers should be careful about when monitoring North Korea?
Well, most North Korea watchers are always very careful about rumors and gossip and speculation. There are many very unusual stories that are told about North Korean leaders and their health. And very often we don't have any way to confirm whether these stories are true or not. So for people who assumed that Kim Jong-un was dead or incapacitated, I think it's a good reminder that we should be very careful about believing gossip and rumor and speculation until we've actually had a little bit more time to look at the evidence.
So why was Chairman Kim Jong-un's health of so much concern to the U.S.? What were the stakes for the U.S.?
Well, I think the big concern is that if North Korea hasn't a clear leadership, if Kim Jong-un is dead or incapacitated, and there's a political struggle over succession, that could lead to uncertainty about who controls North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile forces, which could raise the risk of conflict. That's the primary U.S. fear.
Mm-hmm. So instability of who is going to control these nuclear weapons seem to be one of the major concerns, like Mr. Seymore mentioned. Are there any stakes that the U.S. has here, Mr. Snyder?
Well, yeah, I think that basically what is happening is that the main focus of the U.S. on North Korea's nuclear weapons capability as a representation of North Korean strength and ability to lash out is potentially could be replaced by a manifestation of North Korea's weakness if indeed instability results from problems connected with succession.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Samore, you served in the government in the past 2 administrations. So when there were rumors of the North Korean leader's health conditions, how did the U.S. track or how did the U.S. confirm these rumors, speculations about the leader's health?
Well, in my experience, the U.S. government has very weak ability to monitor the health of North Korean leaders. Of course, the U.S. government hears lots of rumors and gossip about the North Korean leaders, their work habits, and what they do after work. But trying to confirm all of that is extremely difficult. And in the past, at least, the U.S. has not really learned about dramatic developments like the death of Kim Il-sung or the death of Kim Jong-il until it was officially announced by the DPRK.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Samore, I want to trace back to what you said earlier. So what are some of the sources that the government relies on in order to try to verify these rumors?
Well, as a general matter, the U.S. tries to gain information from many different sources, including a collection of information from human beings, collection from signals intelligence, telephone calls, faxes, emails, and so forth, as well as overhead satellite photography, plus, of course, public information. North Korean government, like all governments, puts out information. And so the U.S. analyzes all of that. But to know about the health of a particular individual, that requires very precise information which is known to only a very few people in the North Korean government.
So we know that the U.S. has a contingency plan on North Korea, but what kinds of different scenarios do these contingency plans cover?
Well, the most important contingency deals with military scenarios. If North Korea were to launch an attack on the South, which could range everything from artillery and a rocket attack on Seoul to an actual invasion across the DMZ. So most of the effort by the allies, by the US and the ROK, is focused on military defense, military preparations. But since the 90s, the US and the ROK have also looked at contingencies for offensive military operations. In other words, for US and ROK forces to move north of the DMZ in the event that there was a complete collapse of political order and public order in North Korea, and it was necessary for the US and ROK forces to go north in order to restore order, the humanitarian crisis, and to secure nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. So there's a whole range of scenarios that are available, and one of them is for there to be an effort to restore order in North Korea, if that were to happen.
So there were reports citing government officials saying that the U.S. has a contingency plan in the absence of Chairman Kim. So do you think the U.S. is prepared to carry out these contingency plans?
Well, it's not really the absence of leadership that would trigger that contingency. It's more a breakdown of public order. So you could have a situation where there was uncertainty about who was in charge, but at the same time, the North Korean state continued to operate, continued to function. The military was under control and public order was in place, and that wouldn't be a reason for the U.S. and the ROK to take any actions to intervene. It's only if there was a breakdown of the North Korean state. And that, of course, hasn't happened.
Mr. Snyder, what would you advise policymakers to prepare for any kind of contingent situations like this in North Korea?
I think the main thing that is going to be a driver for an active response by North Korea's neighbors is going to be the potential for spillover effects, which means destabilization rather than leadership succession as the potential trigger for action. Beyond that, I think in terms of leadership succession, as we have seen in the past, the core instinct of external observers is going to be to watch and wait.
And I want to touch upon an interesting article that the Economist Intelligence Unit published. It said that with sanctions and the threat of the pandemic, North Korea is likely to turn to a more hardline stance to cover up its weakness. What is your take on this?
It means, but if it means that North Korea will continue to reject an agreement to essentially give up its nuclear weapons, then I think that's very likely. But from my standpoint, North Korea will take that position, whatever the state of the economy is, at least for the foreseeable future. So I think North Korea has made it very clear that it won't accept American proposals for a comprehensive plan for denuclearization.
Yeah, some of the economic data that is coming out of North Korea suggests that that actually could be the greater risk that the country faces right at this moment, especially if they're facing a currency shortage. And so this is a space that we need to continue to watch very closely to see whether the duration of the quarantine and sanctions measures proves to introduce new stresses into the North Korean economy.
So the coronavirus pandemic was definitely an uncertain factor that North Korea did not foresee last year. So we'll have to see what kind of moves North Korea decides to make in the face of looming uncertainties within the regime. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Seymore and Mr. Snyder, for offering your insights today.
Thanks, Connie.
Thank you, Connie.
Thank you. That does it from all of us here at Voice of America. Thank you for joining. Do join us again next week for more analysis on North Korea. Goodbye.